Fondation Jean-Jaurès.
Penser pour agir.
Welcome to this online exchange on the transformation of the European economic governance. I'm talking to you from the headquarters of Fondation Jean-Jaurès that is organizing this online talk together with FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at the Columbia University. I'm David Rinaldi, Director of Policies and Studies at FEPS, and I have the pleasure to welcome you in this talk. You probably know that Professor Stiglitz and FEPS, and we are very happy to have Professor Stiglitz with us here today, once again to discuss about fiscal policies and the monetary union. He has been, together with FEPS, very vocal already in the past about the need to rewrite the rules of the European economy. And it is exactly a framing that was used for a book that was published in 2019. So it is actually not a novelty that the fiscal framework for Europe, that the economic architecture is to be reformed and revised. But what is maybe the novelty is that it appears that the time for these revisions and reform it has come. The Commission will likely put forward some proposals to adapt the economic rules to the changing environment. Not only we have the dramatic events of the crisis and the war in Ukraine and the following shortage of energy, gas, and electricity, with the negative impact of the sanctions, the increase in spending for the defense, but we have somehow clearly identified in Europe common objectives, fighting the climate emergency, equipping our societies to recover from the pandemic. And probably now the objective of a monetary union, focusing almost uniquely on the stability of the macroeconomic sector, is a little bit narrow. And there are many voices asking for broader objectives for our monetary union, including sustainability and full employment as potential joint objectives. But before going into the debate with Professor Stiglitz and the other experts, we are happy to have with us Theo Verdier, co-coordinateur de l'Observatoire Europe here at the Foundation Jean-Jaurès. He will present a very interesting study on the perception of the common currency 20 years after their adoption. And we will see with him what the Europeans think about our common currency. Theo, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, David, for the introduction. To begin this debate, I'd like to outline for you our survey on the 20th anniversary of the euro. It's been 20 years and 1 month that there's been a single currency of the euro for the 12 EU members. It was 12 states, 19 now. The question back then was whether the euro would be both a factor to foster integration, whether the actual arrival of this object, this means of payment, this euro for hundreds of millions of Europeans, would make it possible to Europeanize people's mindset. And also the question was, would Europe be the last stage toward the single market and the promise of prosperity, which was the promise? We've just seen 2 decades of the European construction, amazing stages, amazing achievements, up in 2002 and then enlargement in 2004, before changes in 2005. Now, once again, we're in a phase of crossing into a new area, a new major milestone in the European construction. Think of the stimulus plan, think of the question today regarding European sovereignty and the area of defense, as well as energy and geopolitics. The question is if the euro has reached its maturity and what the relationship is that the Europeans have with the single currency. 3 major periods in history. First of all, the initial starting point, In southern countries, they were mainly in favor of the euro. There was a little bit of opposition from Germany and clear opposition from Denmark. That was the situation back in the 1990s. The situation remained fairly stable until the crisis 2008 to 2014-15. 2008, first alarm sounded. The first time 45% of Europeans felt the euro was a good thing for their countries. It was the first period. After this, we heard various polls, opinion polling that was very negative. The Europeans had a very negative view of the single currency at that time and the overall economic outcome of the EU in terms of management of the 08, 07, 08 crisis, and then the Greek crisis, sovereign debt crisis, up to the climax of 2015, when we saw the question of the euro exiting the euro area. Then the last period, after the Greek situation, 2015, after Brexit, and after COVID-19 crisis, we're seeing an uptick in public opinion. The euro seems to be a factor of stability, and now that the UK has made it possible in people's minds to exit the EU, people have realized what the meaning of that is, the significance. So if we look at this today, 70% of Europeans, 7 out of 10, feel the euro is a good thing for their country. It's very interesting to see that. Things have really turned around versus the 1990s. The northern countries tend to view the euro mainly as something positive. Maybe 76% of Germans, then a second group of countries, mainly from Central Europe and Greece. They're around the median, feeling that the euro is a good thing. Then you have the southernmost states, Spain, Italy, Portugal, that have a more differing relationship with the single currency. Nevertheless, the majority is support for the euro, for the economic and monetary union, which is perceived, viewed throughout the eurozone. An interesting thing, the 6 states that would theoretically be candidates for accession, all of them are in the post-COVID crisis, and we saw the ECB's reaction, which was to fund governments and fund debt policies and stimulus policies. Summer of 2020, the stimulus plan was tacked on to make it possible to contend with the economic impact of the crisis. So people's view of the euro now is a tool of resilience, of sturdiness, of economic strength, a way for governments to lessen the impact of external crisis. The Union today is seeing the third in a set of crises. Firstly, in 2019, a heat wave in the continent, and we saw the climate changes and questions regarding the climate. Who formalized a political response? The EU with the Green Pact. Second crisis, the health crisis, economic crisis, the one we're still contending with today, the pandemic. Here we can see the ECB formulated the first response, and the Union in its economic aspects has been creative, contending with the threats and creating a new tool, the stimulus plan, the recovery plan, starting the Union of Transfer, showing greater solidarity to the hardest hit countries. Now, the worst crisis of all, the war has returned to the continent. War has returned. The Union's position has been to support Ukraine, but not being a party to the war. And this shows clearly it's NATO that's there for common defense. Nevertheless, the EU plays a role as an economic geopolitical power and in the future possibly a defensive power. In the economic realm, the crisis we're seeing today is to having these economic sanctions against Russia, accommodating refugees, supporting Ukraine, continuing to receive support in the population by absorbing the economic impact of the current crisis. The problem is there's a shearing effect. You've got inflation on the uptick, and the economic situation is going to mean that governments have to take out debt to finance stimulus once again. Not a done deal, but highly likely. We can see that it's been possible to bail out the Union and maintain economic living standards after the pandemic. Nevertheless, the equation now is a difficult one. We've got the mission regarding inflation and supporting governments. The euro has reached maturity, 20 years and 1 month. Majority of Europeans support it. The question is, what's the consensus in the population going to be for this new dimension, responding to the crisis in Ukraine, war on the continent, which will last for months? And what is the mission statement for the ECB today? Europeans, in the main, support the economic and monetary union. But our poll, when we ask the question, for instance, how should we change the rules governing the euro with an eye to presidential elections in euro. In Europe, there's agreement to stay, to keep the euro, but for the time being, people aren't sure exactly what should be done in terms of budget rules, the ECB's role in terms of budgets, and how we should possibly bring forward the economic and monetary union. So the euro is mature. The question is, what about political consensus that we'll find amongst the 27? A last point, France is right now in a time of presidential elections. It's interesting to observe. You've got the majority support for the Eurozone. When on the fringes, the extremes, Marine Le Pen, Eric Zemmour, and Mélenchon, they have much less support for the euro. But in 1917, once and for all, it was decided not to exit the euro, and the French since then have never appeared to want to talk about exiting the euro. So we realize that there is support for the single currency, and there's approval of the measures done post-COVID, if we look at the figures regarding approval of the stimulus plan and ECB policies. The question is, though, at some point in domestic debate, will it be possible for us to look at the question of how we can address the crisis at the community level, and what's the remit for the ECB in this new situation?
Thanks, Theo, for this interesting presentation about the perceptions of citizens around the euro, our common currency. And it's my honor now to introduce our next speaker. He's Nobel laureate in economics. He's university professor at Columbia University and founder and president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. Thanks so much for being here, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have you here. So you were one of the first and most critical voices about raising concerns about economic integration in Europe. So now, 30 years after the Maastricht Treaty, 20 years after the arrival of the euro, we wanted to assess with you these past decades and analyze with you also what is the way forward. But before going into this particular matter, there's an issue that unfortunately we cannot avoid, which is the war. So I would like to get your assessment about what is going to be the economic impact in Europe of the war, the sanctions, the energy crisis.
Well, I mean, first, I think Europe should be congratulated at the speed of the response, the scope of the sanctions. I think they were absolutely necessary. It's not clear that they will be sufficient. Sanctions are only effective when they are near universal, and the big question mark is what will China do, and will they circumvent? But I think the solidarity that has been shown among the democracies all around the world is important, and I think bodes very well for the euro, because the euro was created originally to promote political solidarity in Europe. And my criticisms were that the way it was designed, I was worried would have just the opposite effect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We heard from the previous presentation that support towards the euro, since you were mentioning now the euro, is increasing, and this is connected very much with the pandemic. Do you think that the European Union, countries working together, can offer a better protection to European citizens than countries working on their own?
Oh, very much so. And the response to the pandemic, like the response to the Ukrainian invasion, was, again, very impressive, very different from the response to the euro crisis just a few years earlier. The fact that they issued the $750 billion of euro bonds to have joint financing was a very important step forward. It was historic, recognizing that the individual countries could not borrow on their own that amount without significant adverse economic, financial effects. But coming together, it was actually very easy, without any disturbance to financial markets, for them to raise the money that is going to be very important, not only for the recovery from the pandemic, mitigating the economic downturn, but also dealing with the necessity of addressing climate change.
Mm-hmm. Back in 2016, you wrote the book, The Euro, How a Common Currency Threatens the Future of Europe, where you were very critical with the common currency, but I believe also it was about the austerity measures by the finance ministers in the Eurozone. Now, as you were saying, it seems the European Union is in a very different path. We have very interesting tools such as the European Green Deal, the European Pillar of Social Rights, the Next Generation EU Investment Plan, the SURE. So I would like to know, do you see a learning curve here? And more specifically, can the euro be useful to support this new path? What's your view?
I think there definitely has been a learning curve. I had thought that the world had already learned that austerity never worked when the euro crisis broke out. And so I was very disappointed that Europe, the Troika, pushed this austerity package on Greece, on Ireland, on Spain, on Portugal. Didn't work. Or let me put it like that. Every crisis, I said, is eventually resolved. The question is how much pain, how much suffering, how much loss of GDP, how much loss of future growth occurs in the interim. And the way the euro crisis was managed with the austerity, I think, was a disaster. Europe could have managed the crisis with much less suffering on the part of so many people. Yeah, the fact that memories are short is a good thing. So the study that you mentioned shows that there's less bitterness than I might have thought after that really very tragic experience. But there is this learning curve that austerity doesn't work, and that to address these new challenges like the pandemic, Europe has to work together, and they showed that they could.
Mm-hmm. Another book is the one you wrote in 2019 together with FEPS, Rewriting the Rules of European Economy. And here you were advocating about the need to transform the Stability and Growth Pact. Now the European fiscal rules are in a sort of a standby, and this is connected, of course, with the pandemic in order to manage the impact of the COVID crisis in the European economy. And the debate about the need to transform and to reform these fiscal rules is more alive than ever before, I would say. The European Commission will put forward soon a proposal on how to revise this Stability and Growth Pact. So what I would like to know is, how would you suggest EU leaders should proceed, should move forward in this context?
Well, there's a whole range of responses that I think need to be done. Let me begin with what you might say a clean slate approach. If you hadn't had the history, if you didn't have difficulties of changing the rules, what I would have perhaps recommended to start with, and then go, change is difficult once you have the rules, and then so where might Europe go from where it is today? Well, I think what we've learned in the last 30 years, 20 years, is that there is just deep uncertainty about the world. Who would have predicted in 1992, when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, that you would have 9/11, 2001? Who would have, and the Iraq War? Who would have predicted the financial crisis of 2008? Who would have predicted Brexit? The pandemic, and now the Ukrainian invasion. I mean, all of these are events that happen regularly, but are unpredictable. The only thing we can predict is that there's going to be something unpredictable. So that's what we've learned. Simple rules can't work in that kind of uncertain environment. And it's foolish to pretend that they can. We will inevitably say, oh, this is an exception. That's an exception. This is an exception. But if you have an exception every few years, the rules become empty. They undermine trust. Who decides what is an exception and not? And it becomes very contested and subject to favoritism. So I think given this deep uncertainty that we should now know that we face, it's better to have guidelines saying this is what we think is normal, but the world is always confronting new situations. You give a reasoned argument for why you ought to, individual countries need to depart. In other words, there should be more trust of the individual countries. One of the things that I've been so struck by is the lack of trust in government, by government. And how do you have a system of solidarity where you say, I don't trust you? To me, I think it's undermining the EU itself. So it should be based on trust, but saying, okay, you have to give reasoned arguments for departures, recognizing the change, the shocks to the economy, the shocks to the world, the changing structure of the world. So that would be the framework that I think makes most sense and what we should have learned from the last 25 years. Now, the minimal change that you need is clearly saying you need more flexibility, and that means you have to go to what is sometimes called the golden rule, the green rule, that you exempt investment from, say, the 3% deficit to GDP ratio. The reason why I say that is, first, you need to remember the numbers were just pulled out of thin air. There was no economic analysis saying that if you exceeded that, there was going to be some adverse effect. In fact, the idea that there would be significant cross-border externalities that would have undermined the euro, that itself was very little economic theory. What has undermined the euro was the kind of rigidity, the austerity that was imposed in the euro crisis. Think about any firm. No firm operates with a deficit to output criteria. You need, if you're a growing firm, to invest more. If you are going through a period of rapid transition, like the green transition, you need to invest more. If you're going through a period of rapid transition, like the digital transition, you need to invest more. So the investment is future-oriented and can't, in any logical way, be related to current GDP. It needs to be related to the returns on those investments. So the basic framework of the Growth and Stability Pact, I think, was fundamentally economically flawed. And what I just suggested is the minimal reforms that are needed.
Mm-hmm. So if I understood correctly, guidelines rather than rules, in order to ensure enough flexibility for the future, not to predict the unpredictable, but taking into account that unpredictable issues will happen, as we have seen in the last year. Thanks so much, Professor Stiglitz, for being here in this interview. Stay here a little bit more. Now you're going to be joined by other experts for a follow-up debate. And this is going to be moderated by my colleague, David Rinaldi, who is Director of Studies and Policies at FEPS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci, Ainara. Thanks a lot for giving me back the floor. And we are now happy to extend the debate with experts that have joined us at the headquarters of Fondation Jean-Jaurès. We have with us Xavier Ragot, Director of the Office Sciences Po, Pervenche, co-directrice de l'Observatoire Europe here at the Fondation Jean-Jaurès, and as well former chair of the Economic Committee at the European Parliament. So you have seen the development of economic policy in Europe through time. And we are happy to have Adrienne Brotons, aussi membre de l'Observatoire économique de la Fondation Jean-Jaurès. So my first question to the three of you is very simple. We have heard from the discussion that there is somehow a big desire to change the economic rules in Europe, but very little clarity about the extent to which we can go. Do you actually think that we will be able to achieve some meaningful change? The feeling is that we were first waiting for the German elections. Now we are waiting for the French election. We will ever arrive to a concrete proposal? Xavier Ragot, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I agree. This idea of budgetary coordination, this is a central question. It's very important, and let me explain why. When you think of the European construction, there's this idea that budgetary discipline, the 3%, the 70%, the 60%, and then the very effective dynamic central bank would be enough to stabilize the Eurozone. But then there was crisis after crisis, which led to further complexity of budgetary rules, and we end up in a situation where you've got rules that are difficult to understand, not very effective from an economic point of view, and I think even the finance ministers in the euro area don't understand them fully. Only experts understand these rules fully. But the overall effect is that this leads to some distrust as to how the budget tool can be used to cope with crisis, economic crisis, energy crisis, and maybe even fund other spending, so maybe health spending, possibly military spending, which is all to say, this idea of budgetary governance is in a time of crisis. I think a lot of players, even politicians in France, in Germany, and even northern countries, they realize something's wrong. Something needs to be done. That something isn't clear, though, yet. What is that something to be done? It's fuzzy. There are two options, and it hasn't been decided on by the French presidency yet. There's one option to try to really achieve long-lasting, sustainable European debt. Real tools to be used to tackle future crises and make it possible to actually take out European debt, similar to what was done previously with the 700 billion. So either European debt, or you can say, no, European debt's difficult, that would lead to transfers, require own resources, and so forth. In that case, the idea would be greater flexibility with the current rules. Greater flexibility might be achieved without changing the treaties, amending the treaties. There are basically three positions. Firstly, the German position, this is my view of things, whereby they say, we don't really change the rules, too complicated, but we become very flexible. We make it possible to go over the 60% mark of debt and make the pact flexible. That's my understanding of the new team at the Ministry of Finance in Germany. Then another position is we change the rules, excluding investments, green investments, health investments, defense spending. I would not be in favor. I know some colleagues would be in favor. I'm not, because they end up excluding everything for investments. The strategy of excluding certain types of investments, well, the list of investments gets very lengthy, and I think it would be the wrong approach, the wrong model. The third model is to say, if there's no European debt, then you give up the rules, get rid of the rules, you agree to the main principles, debt stability, and then you manage at the European level, European budgets that, and debt levels can vary depending on the needs of each economy. It's a position that was defended with Jean-Paul Fiteri and Martin, saying that let's let the domestic budgets be highly flexible to deal with those situations. There's no decision to be made on either of these three yet, and that's why things are fairly fuzzy and vague in asking about European debt now.
Exactly on this issue of the sort of golden rule. Two potential options, maybe alternative to what you have just proposed. One that goes in the direction of a green golden rule with a typology of green spending and green fiscal financial spending already decided by the Commission or on the way to be decided. So somehow that we might have a clear-cut menu of what can be a green investment. If that could be one way, so without expanding to education, defense, just green and just based on a list that is already agreed by the Commission. Second option, instead, something more similar to the governance of the recovery, in the sense that, as the Commission is used to do now, you ask plans to member state, and then the Council and the Commission decide whether the investment plan of a given member state is solid enough, can be productive enough, to be exempt from the debt to GDP rule. Would you see any benefit in either of these two options?
I don't think it's ambitious enough. It's not ambitious enough. It wouldn't work. And if it doesn't work, it's just going to fall apart. Let me explain why. What's the objective in everything we're doing right now? We're trying to avoid sovereign default of any country. If a country were to have to take out large-scale debt to achieve growth, inclusive growth as it's called today, making it possible to repay that debt, they have to be able to do this even if these aren't in green investments, your first option. They have to be able to do this in conjunction with their own democracy, their social partners. It mustn't jeopardize sustainability of public debt. The Commission can't question the local governments. For instance, in France, we need to invest in education. This is the main subject, the main issue. Think of lacking math skills and so on and so forth. These are recurring expenditures. If you do that without public debt, to recapitalize our education system, so to speak, if we can use that term, to recapitalize, invest in education, the question is the Commission entitled to say, no, France, we don't think so? So you can't jeopardize public debt and the sustainability of public debt. And as long as you don't jeopardize it, it should be possible to take out that debt. So I'd be in favor of even greater flexibility in managing domestic debt if this doesn't jeopardize sustainability of debt. So I'd very much agree with Pierre Blanchard and others saying we mustn't let the Commission micromanage local debt. Each country is up to its own, decides on its own stimulus. Assuming this doesn't destabilize the Eurozone, clearly. Otherwise, I think there'd be friction which would lead to major problems.
Madame Beres, you had the chance from the European Parliament to have a special observation on multiple changes that affected Europe since the previous crisis. Would you have guessed that we would have made it to arrive to a sort of joint borrowing? And where do you think we can go from there?
I will answer also in French.
You're right. In my term in office, I fought hard for the euro area to have its own budget and its ability to borrow. So when the common borrowing arrived, I thought it was really good news. But we have to make one observation, and I wasn't the only one to say this. At my side, I've got someone who also pushed in the same direction I did, agreed with me. Our rationale was always within the framework of the Eurozone. We have to include this in the debate. This is very important in a time of crisis and war such as today, because to some degree, these scopes of projection, thinking of French ambitions, our perimeter, so to speak, isn't always the right one. And let me tell you what I mean by that. The question of the euro, the single currency, is a major consideration, a major question. The euro has already dealt with 2 crises. We don't know what the third one will look like. But that's not the main subject for the European debate, as I see it. Borrowing that you're talking about, this was a borrowing that took place at 27. I'm not contesting it, but I'm just saying to equip the euro, to make it resilient against monetary destabilization and problems in financial markets, that's not enough. That doesn't achieve that resilience. And briefly, parenthetically, to talk about the scope of French intervention. You see a paradox when you talk about defense spending for France. For a lot of players in France, our scope for projection means strategic autonomy for Europe. And we see all the indicators are there that if you look at the war in Ukraine, the NATO, the Atlantic Alliance, is going to be taking leadership, fundamental leadership. So why do I emphasize the importance of the Eurozone itself? There are at least 3 shortcomings, as I see it, aside from things you might be thinking of. Firstly, the rules for the functioning of the Eurozone don't make it possible to invest. They're not designed to provide investment. But the major challenge for our economies today is to find investment, large-scale, massive investment, whatever the area of intervention for the given investments. A second point, I agree with Xavier and Ragot, the idea that each country needs to be able to democratically define its own social contract as long as it does not jeopardize sustainability of the single currency. But there's another aspect of the dimension which I think is underestimated, i.e., Eurozone economies have to have a comprehensive overarching view and the appropriate tools to rise to economic challenges together. And in that respect, the common borrowing isn't a good example. This common borrowing is good in terms of pooling subsidies and loans, but not in terms of spending. We didn't finance any European spending through this mechanism, whereas this idea of the overarching overview and aggregate fiscal stance, that's something that's very important if we want the euro to be an optimal tool serving the European social contract. And then a third point that concerns me. I think there's a cost of adjusting, which is gigantic. We saw this during the COVID crisis. This, for instance, with the position of some people in Germany. Some people said, well, since the pact has been placed aside, it's okay, it's shown it's flexible, so we can keep it. But a budget rule that was set 20 years ago in a radically different context, a radically different global situation, and situation vis-a-vis globalization, has been this idea of having the European Central Bank sacred isn't the right way of doing things. I'm in favor of rules for governing things, for coordinating things, but the rules have to be suited to the current challenges of our economies, and there has to be a certain amount of flexibility to be able to act in an intelligent fashion as the needs arise. Also, let me say there's one piece of good news, so to speak. I was worried about that the pact might come into force before being reformed, and even the council. What's it called? The Stability Council. The High Council for the European Fiscal Board said it needed to be reformed before being reenacted. The calendar wasn't right, though. The date that's currently slated for the return of the Stability Pact is 1 January 2023. Nobody can imagine that between now and 1 January 23 we'll have agreed to smart reforms of the pact. I saw the Eurogroup, which met beginning of the week, hasn't yet duly noted that the suspension's to be extended to 2023. They'll decide in May or June. But we can certainly hope that considering the shock, the macroeconomic shock due to the war in Ukraine to all the European economies, we hope that wisdom will prevail pending intelligent reform of the pact. I would be in favor of having a rule making it possible to invest throughout the European Union, but we mustn't underestimate the challenges regarding our currency. The central bank can't do everything all by itself.
Merci, Madame Beres. Ma prochaine question, c'est pour Madame Breton.
Thank you, Madame Beres. My next question is for
Professor
Madame
Stiglitz
Breton.
before, and also from Xavier and Pervenche, the need for big investments. How can we solve this structural bias for, suboptimal investment in Europe? What's the way to go?
Thank you for your question.
We all know we're going to need increased investments in upcoming years. We've just overcome more or less the pandemic. I say overcome, but the pandemic isn't necessarily over with yet. It's conceivable in the next few months and years, member states may yet again need to cough up money to deal with yet another pandemic. That's maybe the current one's not fully under control. So there's always that risk of the pandemic, which is hanging over our heads in Europe, and we may be required to make further investments by member states and by the EU itself. And of course, there's the climate challenge, which is very much coming to the fore. In all European countries, investments are lacking, are insufficient to rise to the environment challenge. In addition to all of that, you now have the conflict in Ukraine, which is going to probably have a negative impact on European economic growth. Therefore, we'll probably need some stimulus within Europe and member states. So yes, it'll be necessary to make increased investments in future years. I agree with Pervenche Beres. We need to rethink our rules regarding the Stability Pact. Like a lot of people in France, I used to be very critical of these rules, and I was glad that they were made somewhat flexible during the toughest times, particularly during the pandemic, regarding the 3% deficit and the 60% debt. Now, it's not because the rules weren't good that we don't need any rules at all. I'm just as worried today about the absence of rules as I was worried in the past that the rules were too strict and almost absurd under the Stability Pact, which is why they have to be thought through, rethought. There are several ways of tackling this. Either we can say, okay, we keep a criterion around 3% deficit, and we transfer some of investment spending to the European federal level. So we move one step toward a European federal level. We have some European Investment Fund, for instance, for climate transition. In this case, the question is about one of our own resources. That's no small debate. I'm not totally sure we'll manage to achieve this in the next few months or years, but at any rate, generally speaking, Europe tends to make progress during times of crisis. Maybe the Ukraine crisis will be a trigger to thinking about energy problems in Europe, but I'm fairly pessimistic. I don't think this will be enough to actually have major investment spending in Europe on the various subjects of climate, energy transition, therefore, and leading to your own resources in Europe, which would be enough to deal with dropping investments by the member states. What I think might be more simple would be to remove some investment spending in energy transition. I think we could reach an agreement on some of that investment spending could be removed from the rules. But what was said earlier, investment spending is part of the challenge. We've seen there are different situations in each country. Each member state wants to keep control over its, to be able to give preference to its own citizens when they're deciding on investments. We agree on climate throughout Europe, but we all have to choose our own social model and our level of social funding in each country. This is why I think sometimes we probably focus too much on the budget tool at the European level and we forget the monetary tool. I think we have to think about the ECB's mandate, such as the inflation target. The inflation target around 2%. If we move into a period of high inflation, some economists are talking about green inflation, linked to skyrocketing in commodity prices, which would not just be a hiccup, but long-lasting due to the greater scarcity of some resources. So if we see this type of inflation due to increased commodity prices. We'll have to reconsider the remit of the ECB. Maybe the 2% is not the right target. Maybe we could review the inflation target. It could be evaluated. You could think of inflation throughout an economic cycle. An economic cycle is longer, broader, and might lend itself to greater flexibility. So first subject is the target, inflation target. Second subject, debt differences, debt variances. We have to avoid sovereign default. Obviously, as was just said, that's the main risk, of course, for the Eurozone. But you must also avoid there to be big differences, big spread differences in terms of funding for each country. For instance, Italy typically finances its debt at a very high level, and that means Italy is forced into de facto budgetary austerity because of the differences of their spread with German debt, and maybe that's not entirely justified. In 2010, the European Central Bank said whatever it takes to save the euro. The question I'm wondering about is, should we go further than that? Have a European Central Bank that might say, okay, I would accept the spread between France, Italy, and Germany, and that would be a minimum X and a maximum of Y, a sort of spread, snake spread, and the ECB could say, if the spread goes beyond a certain amount, I'll buy back some debt to reduce it. But once you said that, it's like when you said whatever it takes, it never actually happens. It has an effect on markets if they just have that knowledge. So we shouldn't just think of the fiscal tool that makes us have problems with member state debates and closes us off. We must think about the monetary tool. The ECB's mandate maybe is no longer exactly where it should be, rising to the challenge that we need to contend with now.
Thanks a lot for this interesting proposal as well on the new mandate and new policies for the European Central Bank. Professor Stiglitz, I come to you for a question that for me is the critical question, linked to what Adrienne just said. We have discussed before with you as well that we need investment, and I think there is a sort of overwhelming evidence in this direction. Then the question here is, do we need investment at the national level or at the European level? Or, of course, it will be a combination of the two, indeed. But at the moment, the European investment in Europe is about 3% of the overall public investment. I think in the US it's maybe half of it, 45–50%. The debt is largely at national level in Europe, and we are discussing now to create a real European debt. Where do you see the difference in view of the challenges of having national spending and national debt with respect to a European spending, European fiscal stance, and the European debt?
Well, as it's already been mentioned, the big difference between the United States and Europe, one of the big differences is the fraction of public spending that's at the federal level is 2/3 in the United States, 1/3 at the state level, and the fraction of spending that's at the EU level is minuscule. It's 1–2% of Europe's GDP, and most of that has been, a lot of that has been focused on agriculture, very more a limited remit. That means that Europe doesn't have the fiscal space to address the common issues and to address the potential divergences that arise between the different countries. So, again, to give the analogy in the United States, when one part of the country was weak, we could divert more money to that part of the country, and that stabilizes the country, and that reduces the extent of regional differences. We haven't eliminated it at all, but we've certainly, it gives us an additional tool, which, given the size of your expenditures, you can't do. You have some institutions that we don't have, and you should recognize that European Investment Bank we wish we had, a lot of us wish we had a development bank or an investment bank. We don't have it. And the EIB has really taken on its role of counter-cyclical stabilization and filled the gap a little bit. And that is a good institution, but it doesn't make up for the lack of fiscal space at the European level. So at a minimum, the investments that should be done at the European level are those investments which are of benefit to all of Europe. And that includes global warming. That's a global public good. And everybody in Europe benefits from that. You shouldn't put that burden on a particular country, climate change. But there's also, I think, big advantages of having everybody in Europe be well educated. And how you balance out some degrees of local control versus the European EU interest in having everybody educated is a difficult question, a question you'd deal with under the topic of subsidiarity, but you should recognize that having a well-educated population is of benefit to all of the EU, and the people migrate. If you have a system of free migration, you have to recognize there are some implications of that, and that means one of your most important assets, human capital, ought to be invested at the EU level. And of course, a transportation system that brings together all of the EU is an asset that's a value to all, it changes your economic geography. And that's another example. Another example that you are now experiencing in Spain is a common energy system. You've had a big energy shock. And because there have been attempts to make a common energy system, but it hasn't gone far enough. And that will mean that there'll be very disproportionate effects of the high gas prices or cut off from Russia gas. And one should recognize that that is an important aspect of European solidarity. So investments in a common green energy system, I think is important.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. And I go back to Madame Berès with a very simple question I would like to ask you, even to respond briefly. But we are gathering here today to ask your inputs, not only for the future of European economic governance, but also for a little assessment of this 20 years of monetary union. It's like 20 years that the euro has been launched, 30 years from the Maastricht Treaty. One thing that makes you proud of our common currency, and one thing that instead you don't like and you would like to see changed.
Well, the answer is very simple. But first of all, I would like to echo what Joseph Stiglitz just said, because it's very important. So you talked about human capital in Europe and investment in member states. So there are a couple of topics that we've been talking about forever. So the ability to store gas and to have common reserves, common supply, and the interconnection of electric grids, because we're all well aware that if we want to have solidarity between member states, depending on how dependent they are on Russian gas, without good interconnections, we can't do it. So there's a great examples on things that have been challenges because of national sovereignty, and we need to overcome such barriers. Let's hope that the Ukrainian crisis might be useful in this way. So the second thing is that we have the euro. It's a great tool, extraordinary tool. We haven't tapped into its full potential yet. We haven't used its full political potential in terms of integration. So at the moment, everyone talks about sovereignty. So what better tool could there be? A tool for monetary sovereignty. So when you see what's happening between nations at the G7, what the Europeans have is the ability to contribute to a great balance between currencies and financial stability. So the euro is quite extraordinary. My biggest regret is that the euro does not come with an intervention capacity, not just in times of crisis, but also to finance investment strategies that should support our growth as strategy in Europe.
1 second, because I think you have to leave us if I'm not wrong.
I apologize for all of you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Pervenche. In a monetary union, dear Xavier, we have somehow given up the possibility of having interest rates that adapt to the different national circumstances for a monetary integration at the European Central Bank level. And we have basically lost one of the key adjustments that usually work in an economy through the exchange rate. Something that would balance off the balance of trade. That is one of the imbalances that is still going on at the European Union level. It's definitely not making it up to the political agenda, because technically having a trade surplus is definitely a positive thing, but maybe in a monetary union it isn't. And the other type of adjustment that we have now instead is we are left with the adjustment that was in vogue during the sovereign debt crisis, that was pushing wages down, so sort of internal deflation. And the other option is internal mobility within the European Union, allowing workers to move from where there is unemployment to where activity is there. What can we do in a monetary union to provide somehow more adjustments so that the big difference between the core economies and the periphery is not somehow increasing, but we are going towards a sort of convergence? My feeling is that the structure at the moment doesn't really allow for convergence in the long term. Am I wrong?
A little bit yes, but I'm starting to be less pessimistic than your assessment. Let me elaborate on that. Indeed, the main issue of the euro was the lack of exchange rate. Second, that we created the euro before Germany really absorbed East Germany, Czechia, and so on and so on. And we entered the euro with a Germany with a very high unemployment, and then wage moderation for 15 years. And indeed, the internal exchange rate of Germany within the euro was undervaluation, such that Germany was a world exporter in 2016. And indeed, we had a world imbalance, which was the German current account, for sure. This was the case until 2015. And market forces created divergence of inflation rates and of internal exchange rate within the euro. What happened in 2015, we discussed a lot about that with German colleagues. That things happened, I think, in Germany. There was a political answer to that, which was creating a minimum wage at a high level, and then we saw an increase in wages in Germany for the last 5 years, which is kind of rapid. And now if you compute the internal exchange rate in the euro, Germany is closing the gap. The new government of Olaf Scholz has decided to increase, hopefully we'll do that, the minimum wage to 12 euros, so it's high. So there will be wage inflation in Germany, so that's good. So the way we dealt with the world imbalances with the German surplus was a new institutions on the German labor market and some political improvements to correct market forces, to increase wage in Germany, to correct the internal exchange rate. So now, if the trend is continuing, I'm less pessimistic. France, Italy, Spain will recover some space to export some goods, and the exchange rate of the euro vis-à-vis the dollar will increase. So we can rebalance the thing. My assessment is that In front of this assessment, we need political intervention on the labor market to avoid divergence of wages. And I have advocated a wage stance in the euro area, saying that European institutions should look at the dynamic of wages and the tradable, non-tradable sector and give some broad advice in the bargaining process at the national level to say that, okay, this country could have more wage inflation than this other. We have a fiscal stance and to have a wage stance discuss collectively to manage this lack of internal exchange rate. We did it with some decentralized institutional coordination. We need more institution. I really think that we need a Ministry of Labor at the European level. People discuss a lot about the Ministry of Finance, but we need a Ministry of Labor to discuss labor market institutions. Are they consistent to avoid that? And to give some advice to have a European labor market, to create a real European labor market. We are not there yet, but I'm less pessimistic than 5 years ago. Things have moved, even in Germany, people realized. So we are in a good track. If there's no big macroeconomic shock, I think we will go in a good direction in terms of correcting those imbalances.
Merci Xavier. Adrienne, même question pour toi aussi.
Thank you, Xavier. Same question for you, Adrienne.
In Europe, good things about the monetary union, and I think that instead you would change tomorrow.
On internal differences within the Eurozone, absolutely, that's an important consideration. I understand what Xavier is saying, and he's probably in a better position than me to be optimistic. So I'm glad if he's optimistic. I want to believe this. But I nevertheless do think there's a question of pace, speed. I'm thinking from the French side, not the European side, that differing policies, particularly trade surplus in Germany versus France. This is an important subject for French industry. Deindustrialization in France is also due to the gap with Germany. Deindustrialization has speeded up in recent years, so there's a French emergency. There has to be a rebalancing with Germany. It's urgent. So I understand. Xavier is optimistic, but I hope it'll all move ahead fast enough. The measures to rebalance with Germany are fairly easy-ish. We know increasing VAT by 3 points, as was done, can help. Increasing their social spending also, because Germany's luck compared to France, so to speak, is that their aging demographics and no family policy for years, so social spending in Germany was lower than in France. Now, if Germany were just to increase by 1% its social spending, that would have a big impact on their trade surplus, particularly vis-à-vis France. A last subject, unfortunately, this could be an opportunity. This Ukraine crisis can be an opportunity. We saw Germany was worried about their lacking army, their lacking ability to project quickly to a theater near Europe. Well, clearly, if Germany does increase its defense spending, not only would that be beneficial to the whole of Europe, because it would make it possible to begin being viewed more credibly, militarily speaking, but also it could help balance things out between France and Germany. So, yes, divergence is an important subject. There was an economic tool that had been set up, I believe, in 2012-2013 to track the differences between member states, the divergences. I'm not sure that it really led to anything, though. Okay. We talk about reforming the Stability Pact. Maybe that's an aspect to take into account. Taking into account deficit levels, that's one thing. Taking into account economic differences between states in the Eurozone. I think it's essential to that as well. If we want to maintain an economic sector within Europe that's strong, a strong economy, and if we want to avoid in the longer term that some European countries start thinking the EU is beneficial to some national companies versus others national companies. So when we talk about reforming the Stability Pact and Growth Pact, you've got this question of divergence has to be tackled. This has to be looked at by the new rules, with the rules and criteria yet to be decided. Now, as to the main successes of the euro, as I see it, the biggest success of the euro has been that it overcame the 2010 crisis. It was able to find the requisite flexibility, making it possible for the ECB to do things that probably aren't totally in line with the letter of the treaties, to say that whatever it takes, which ended up saving the euro. That's the strength of the euro. It's a paradox. You've got rules that I think sometimes are absurd, but we've also got the ability during tough times to set aside those rules, set them aside, and make progress during a crisis. And 2010 is a great illustration of this, I think. My regret? Well, unfortunately, we only make progress during crisis. You have to have a crisis to take the right decisions you should have taken previously that would have made it possible to economize, not have all the low growth we had, not have these austerity policies that were really violent in countries such as Greece. A few years later, economists say we went too far enforcing austerity on southern European countries. That's the same economists that previously said, yes, they've got to cut their spending. So my regret is that this Europe is having a hard time thinking ahead and being proactive, thinking ahead toward future crises. We have the 2010 crisis, the 2008 crisis, we have Ukraine today. I hope we'll be more proactive. We'll be able to think ahead to the climate crisis that's ahead of us, and we'll end up having to react when we're between a rock and a hard place.
Thanks a lot as well for this nice picture you gave of the economic and monetary union. Somehow, that is very resilient. To the shocks and to the crisis, able to reinvent itself, and to remain standing, and able to make progress only on crisis, basically. That reminds me of, I think it was just Jacques Delors who said something, that Europe doesn't need only firemen, but also architects. Now I think it's the moment that we have multiple crises, but it's probably, we need to have the ability not only to extinguish fires, but to build for the future. And we conclude the debate today again with Professor Stiglitz, because you have been one of the harsher critics of the European project on the euro, and I think it's now overwhelmingly clear that the member states didn't have clear ideas about all the somehow potential implications of a monetary union, something which maybe was much clearer to you as a lead economist. But at the same time, the project was as much economic as it was a political endeavor. So my question would be, do you see now, 20 years after the entry, the launch of the euro, a value in the political mission of getting many countries together, getting them closer, more united, besides their economy in spirit? Is there a geopolitical value in a common currency?
Well, there's clear geopolitical value in the EU, and I think there's no doubt about that. And the question always was, in my mind, whether a common currency promoted that or actually undermined that. And that depended, in the beginning, it was very clear, would depend on both the rules that would be adopted, how they were interpreted. The rules that were adopted, as I mentioned before, were pulled out of thin air. They had no economic basis. It was very foolish, I thought, to take those rules that had no economic grounding, like 2% inflation, 3% deficit, 60% debt of GDP, and assume that they would serve Europe well. And I think most economists thought that there was enormous risk. The world is always changing. Even if the rules had been supported by evidence prior to the Maastricht, there was no reason to believe that 30, 40, 50 years later, those same rules would serve Europe well. And the way rules change is very difficult. I mean, that's not true, only true in Europe. In the United States, changing foundational rules is very, very difficult. So my own view, my own worry was that the rules would actually promote divergence and in that way undermine the political project. So rather than coming together with a monetary union enhancing political unity, if it created divergence and the view was the euro served the interests of some countries and not others, it would actually undermine political unity. I think the experience through the euro crisis was consistent with that. I think it wasn't as bad as it would have been if they hadn't shown some flexibility, if Draghi hadn't said, we'll do what it takes. But you asked a lot of people in Greece whether they thought it was a pleasant experience that they went through, whether the euro served them well. You asked people in Spain, Ireland, in Portugal, they all would say, no, it was not a good experience. So they would not say that the euro served their interest. And so the view of whether the euro over that 20-year period enhanced the solidarity, and I think it was very clear it did not. Now, we've had that moment of the pandemic and now Ukrainian invasion. I think in the pandemic, Europe got together and issued the Eurobonds, something that many of us said they should have done in the euro crisis. And they didn't go far enough in the senses they didn't create the broader fiscal space, they didn't create a tax system. And maybe what the most important from an economist's point of view, the idea that markets on their own, if you just went by the Growth and Stability Pact and the 2% inflation, would lead to convergence was an absurd idea. There was no economic basis of that. They were worried that there would be cross-border externalities if any country spent more than that. No evidence of that kind of cross-border externality. Many other kinds of cross-border externalities, like tax competition, that one's seen from a couple of the countries in Europe, which has undermined the solidarity within Europe. So I think they focused on the wrong externalities. The hope is that recognizing the nature of those externalities, going forward, they will continue with the success they've had in response to the pandemic and the solidarity that's been shown in response to the Ukrainian invasion, and do some of the things that were talked about during the euro crisis. A banking union, still not happened. Broader fiscal support. There's a whole agenda there, and I think if they do that, then the euro will be the basis of stronger political unity.
I think that's a fantastic sentence to close our debate. So the euro has a chance to be the currency that can fit the purpose of delivering prosperity in Europe if we are able to transform some of the policies around it, including bringing more solidarity, fiscal space, and investment in Europe. A big thanks to the Fondation Jean-Jaurès for hosting this debate and to the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at the Columbia University. Stay tuned, because with FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and Fondation Jean-Jaurès, IPD as well, we will continue discussing how to reform the economic governance of the European Union to make it more fitting with the current objectives that are a little bit more expanded than just focusing on macro financial stability. Thanks to all of you.
Fondation Jean-Jaurès.
Penser pour agir.